Have you ever felt that you are facing an utterly impossible situation where doors seem to close one after another with no solution in sight? Santa Rita of Cascia, universally known as the advocate for impossible causes, has been for centuries the refuge of millions of faithful who, desperate in the face of circumstances that defy all human logic and hope, have found in her a powerful intercessor whose very life is a testimony to how God can transform the deepest tragedies into paths of holiness. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Saint. In the spring of 1381, when the fields of the Umbria region in Italy were adorned with wildflowers, an extraordinary event took place in the small village of Roccaporena. Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri, an elderly couple known for their deep piety, were blessed with the birth of a girl whom they named Margherita, although she would soon be affectionately known as Rita. What made this birth so special was not only the advanced age of her parents, which the villagers considered almost miraculous, but also the strange phenomena that accompanied it. Tradition tells that on the day Rita was born, a swarm of white bees, creatures never before seen in the region, entered through the window of the humble Mancini home and buzzed around the newborn's cradle without causing her any harm. These bees, flying in and out of the little girl's mouth as she slept peacefully, were interpreted by the witnesses as a divine sign, a presage of the sweetness of character and the industrious spiritual life that this child would develop. For centuries, the white bees have remained one of the most recognizable iconographic symbols of Saint Rita. Rita's parents, known as the Peacemakers of Christ for their role as mediators in the frequent disputes between rival families in the region, welcomed their daughter as a divine gift sent to crown a life dedicated to the service of God and one's neighbor. From her earliest childhood, they educated Rita in the principles of the Catholic faith, teaching her not only prayers and devotional practices, but also the value of personal sacrifice and unconditional forgiveness. Every night, Antonio would recount to his little daughter stories of saints and martyrs who had given their lives for the love of Christ, planting in Rita's heart a deep admiration for a consecrated life. Chapter 2. The Obedient Young Girl. As Rita blossomed into adolescence, her physical beauty began to match the inner beauty she had always shown. Her large dark eyes, framed by an uncommon expression of serenity, and her long black hair that fell like a mantle over her shoulders, attracted the attention of the village youth. However, while other girls her age dreamed of advantageous marriages and large families, Rita's heart beat with a different desire to wholly consecrate herself to God through religious life, following the example of the Augustinian nuns whose convent she had visited in the nearby town of Cascia. With the innocent confidence of one sure of her calling, Rita expressed to her parents her wish to join the convent as soon as possible. Antonio and Amata, though deeply religious and admirers of consecrated life, received the news with concern. The times were turbulent in 14th century Italy, torn by wars between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, and families needed strong allies to ensure their safety. The Mancini, already elderly, feared for their daughter's future in such a dangerous world if she were not protected by a husband and a powerful political alliance. After long nights of prayer and deliberation, they informed Rita that she had been promised in marriage to Paolo Ferdinando Mancini, a young man from a good family with whom her parents had arranged agreements long before she expressed her religious vocation. The news struck Rita like a bolt of lightning in her heart. For days, the young woman wrestled in deep spiritual agony, shedding bitter tears over a small crucifix in the most secluded corner of the family garden. How could she renounce what she felt was so clearly a divine calling? Would she not be betraying God if she accepted marriage? In the midst of her confusion, Rita recalled the stories her father had told her about saints who, before reaching the glory of the altar, had endured terrible trials that tested their obedience and humility. One night, while praying with heart-wrenching fervor, Rita experienced a profound inner peace, accompanied by what she would later describe as a soundless voice resonating in her heart. "My daughter, learn first to find me in duty before seeking me in desire." That night, she understood that her first step toward holiness would not be a triumphant entrance into the convent, but the silent sacrifice of her own will. With a serenity that astonished her parents, Rita accepted the arranged marriage, transforming her initial disappointment into an offering pleasing to God. "If it is your will, my parents, I accept it as the will of heaven," were her words when she communicated her decision. What Rita did not know then, though perhaps her heart intuited it, was that this marriage, which seemed to draw her away from her religious vocation, would become the crucible in which her holiness was slowly forged, preparing her for a life of extraordinary intimacy with Christ through redemptive suffering. The wedding was celebrated when Rita was barely 16. Dressed simply, but with the dignity of one who understands that she is performing a sacred act, Rita walked toward the altar of the small church of Roccaporena, not with the exuberant joy of a bride in love, but with the solemn determination of one who has decided to find God on the path of obedience. While exchanging vows with Paolo, a man with a severe countenance, nearly 2 decades her senior and known for his volatile temper, Rita also sealed a secret pact with heaven. She would turn every trial in her marriage into an opportunity to grow in holiness, transforming her home into a sanctuary of peace, even if she had to build it with the stones of personal sacrifice and constant forgiveness. Chapter 3. An exemplary wife and mother. The first light of dawn barely filtered through the rudimentary wooden windows when Rita was already on her knees by her bed, offering the early hours of the day in prayer. This ritual, unchanged since her childhood, had become her spiritual anchor during the 18 years of a marriage that was far from the Christian ideal she had hoped to build. Paolo Ferdinando Mancini turned out to be not only a man of violent character, but also an active participant in the bloody family feuds that plagued the Umbria region. Every night, when her husband returned home with hardened eyes, and often with bloodstains on his clothes, which Rita silently washed, the woman renewed her inner commitment. "I will not repay evil with evil, but overcome evil with good," repeating the words of the Apostle Paul that she had learned from her father. Despite the brutality Rita suffered at the hands of her husband, strikes she endured without complaint, and public humiliations she accepted with dignity, she never allowed bitterness to harden her heart. On the contrary, she responded to each insult with a gentle word, to each blow with an act of service, to every infidelity with an even more intense prayer for Paolo's conversion. The villagers of Roccaporena, silent witnesses to Rita's domestic ordeal, could not understand how this woman, now in the prime of her life, maintained the serenity of her face and the sweetness of her manner with everyone, especially with her tormentor. It is as if her sufferings, rather than withering her soul, were transforming her into something more luminous each day, the local women marveled, many of whom secretly sought Rita's counsel for their own marital problems. The birth of her twins, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, was a ray of light in the darkness of Rita's marital life. From the moment of their conception, Rita consecrated them to God, determined to raise men unlike their father, men of peace in a society steeped in violence. With infinite patience, she taught them the truths of the Catholic faith, taking them with her every morning to the village church, where they remained transfixed watching their mother, immersed in such deep prayer that she seemed transported to another world. At home, Rita countered Paolo's negative influence by inventing games that taught Christian values and by telling stories in which the heroes were not victorious warriors, but humble saints who won souls with love. "Your only weapons must be the truth on your lips and love in your actions," she would repeat as she kissed her children's foreheads before they slept. No one in Roccaporena could have imagined that Rita's persevering prayers were slowly cracking the armor of hatred that encased Paolo's heart. Change began to manifest subtly. Nights when he returned home sober, fleeting moments when he was moved by a tender gesture from his children, instances when his eyes met Rita's and, for the first time in years, he did not avert his gaze in disdain. One particularly significant Sunday, to the astonishment of the whole community, Paolo voluntarily accompanied his family to the Sunday Mass and, even more surprisingly, approached Rita to receive the priest's blessing. Although his transformation was far from complete, these small gestures were, for Rita, divine confirmations that her silent sacrifice was bearing fruit that perhaps she would never fully see in this life. Chapter 4. Tragedy and Forgiveness. The sun was setting behind the hills of Umbria, tinting the sky in reddish hues that seemed to presage the bloody event that would forever change Rita's life. Paolo was returning home along the path lined with olive groves when he was ambushed by members of the Cicchi family, with whom the Mancini had maintained a bitter feud for generations. The stabbings were precise and deadly. Paolo barely had time to pronounce his wife's name before he breathed his last. When Rita received the news, she collapsed to her knees in the center of her humble kitchen. Yet from her lips there did not emerge cries of despair, but rather a surprising prayer. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," echoing the words of Christ on the cross. Paolo's body was brought home, and Rita spent the entire night keeping vigil in silence, washing with her own hands the wounds that had snuffed out the life of the man who, despite his cruelties, had been her husband for 18 years. The neighbors, gathered in the house to support the widow, expected to hear the traditional cry of vengeance that would trigger the ritual of family retribution. Instead, they watched in astonishment as Rita, with a supernatural serenity, placed a crucifix in her late husband's hands and whispered in his ear, as if he could still hear her, "I forgive you for every tear you made me shed, every pain you inflicted on my body. May God in his infinite mercy do the same for you." That night, as hatred festered in the hearts of Paolo's kin, a seed of reconciliation began to sprout in Rita's soul, for she understood that the cycle of violence could only be broken through radical forgiveness. Yet, Rita's true ordeal was only beginning. Her two adolescent children, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, inflamed by the code of honor that prevailed in medieval Italian society, swore on their father's corpse that they would not rest until the blood of their father's murderers was shed. Rita, aware of the spiritual danger in which her children were falling, tried to dissuade them using the evangelical teachings she had instilled in them from a young age. "My children," she pleaded, while holding their hands stained with the blood they had vowed to avenge, "if you take this path, you will lose not only your bodies, but also your souls. Vengeance will not bring your father back to life, but it will rob you of eternal life." Her words, however, crashed against hearts hardened by pain and anger, fueled further by the constant calls for revenge from uncles and cousins. For an entire year, Rita waged a silent battle for her children's souls. Each night, while they slept, she knelt by their beds and, with tears that dampened the earthen floor, offered God a prayer that only a mother capable of loving with the heart of Christ could utter. "Lord, before my children become murderers and lose their immortal souls, bring them into your presence while they still retain the innocence of not having shed blood." This prayer, born of the purest yet most painful maternal love, was unexpectedly answered. An outbreak of plague swept through the region, and in just a few weeks claimed the lives of both young ones. While the neighbors interpreted this dual tragedy as divine punishment upon the family, Rita recognized, even amidst her heartbreaking maternal grief, the merciful response of God to her desperate plea. Completely alone in the world, having lost her husband and both children in less than 2 years, Rita once again astonished the community of Roccaporena with a gesture that defied all human logic. During the Easter celebration, when the village church was filled to honor the resurrection, Rita publicly addressed the Cheeky family, the murderers of her husband, and, in the presence of the whole community, offered them her unconditional forgiveness, sealing it with a kiss of peace on each of their cheeks. "Christ died for all of us, even for his enemies," she declared in a firm voice that echoed through the vaults of the small church. "How could I, who desire to follow in his footsteps, deny forgiveness to those whom he has already forgiven on the cross?" That heroic gesture, which many considered either madness or even a betrayal of her family's memory, was in fact the culminating act that sealed the reconciliation between the rival families, ending decades of violence. More importantly, it was the key that opened the door for Rita to enter a new stage on her path toward holiness, finally allowing her to answer the religious vocation she had suppressed in her youth out of obedience to her parents. Chapter 5. The Path to the Convent. Freed from the matrimonial and maternal bonds that had occupied most of her life, Rita, now 36 years old, felt the call to a consecrated life, which she had experienced in her youth, reawaken with great force. With her heart full of hope, she set out for the monastery of St. Mary Magdalene in Cascia, where the Augustinian nuns led lives of prayer and contemplation that had always drawn her spirit. However, the response she received from the abbess was an unexpected blow. "The doors of this monastery are closed to widows, especially those whose families have been involved in bloody vendettas. The convent statutes, designed to preserve the peace and harmony of the community, specifically excluded women whose past might bring with it external enmities or conflicts that could disturb the contemplative life." Rita tried to gain admission 3 times, and each time she was rejected, despite her pleas and the testimonies of neighbors attesting to her exemplary life and extraordinary capacity for forgiveness. The final refusal was particularly painful, for the abbess, moved by Rita's perseverance, yet bound by the rules, tearfully told her, "My daughter, if God wills for you to be with us, he himself will open a door that no human rule can close." Those words, though not intended as prophecy, resonated in Rita's heart as a divine promise. Returning to her empty home in Roccaporena, Rita transformed her house into a sort of monastic cell, living in extreme poverty, devoting long hours to prayer and serving the sick and needy of the village. The people of Roccaporena began to refer to her as the saint, admiring how this woman who had lost everything found the strength to console those who had much less to lose. One night, while Rita was praying in the privacy of her room, she experienced what she would later describe as a celestial visitation. 3 luminous figures appeared before her: St. John the Baptist, St. Augustine, and St. Nicholas of Tolentino, saints to whom Rita had shown special devotion throughout her life. "Follow us," they commanded. "The time has come for you to receive the reward for your faithfulness." Obeying the vision, Rita left her home and followed the 3 resplendent figures along the dark paths leading to Cascia. Upon reaching the walls of the monastery, Rita watched in astonishment as the heavy oak doors opened without any human hand touching them. The 3 saints led her through the silent corridors to the inner courtyard and, after blessing her, disappeared, leaving her alone under the starry sky. When the nuns rose for the matins, they found Rita kneeling in the center of the cloister, absorbed in prayer as if she had always belonged there. The astonishment was general, not only because of the inexplicable presence of the widowed woman from Roccaporena within the cloistered walls, but also because of the supernatural peace that radiated from her face. When questioned by the abbess about how she had managed to enter a closed and guarded space, Rita simply replied, "My lords, St. John the Baptist, St. Augustine, and St. Nicholas of Tolentino brought me here by the command of him whom we all serve. Rita's extraordinary entry into the monastery was interpreted by the community as an unmistakable sign of divine will, overcoming all previous objections and paving the way for her acceptance as a postulant. Rita's novitiate was not without trials. Some nuns, jealous of the growing reputation of sanctity surrounding the new sister or skeptical about the miracle of her entrance, subjected Rita to deliberate humiliations to test her humility and obedience. The mistress of novices, particularly severe, assigned her the most unpleasant and seemingly absurd tasks: watering a dry stick planted in the garden every day for a year, cleaning the same corridor repeatedly for no apparent reason, copying manuscripts only to destroy them afterward. Rita accepted each trial with a supernatural joy, seeing in every act of obedience an opportunity to die to herself and become more perfectly conformed to the crucified Christ. The wonder of the dry stick that blossomed after a year of faithful watering became one of the first miracles attributed to Rita within the convent, a perennial symbol of how perseverance in seemingly useless tasks can produce unexpected fruit when done out of love for God. Chapter 6. Religious Life. Rita's ceremony of religious profession, celebrated when she was 40 years old, marked the formal beginning of a life that, in its very essence, had already been consecrated to God since her childhood. Clad in the black habit of the Augustinian nuns, with a veil framing a face where past sufferings had left visible traces yet also an indescribable serenity, Rita pronounced her vows in a clear and firm voice. "I promise to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience until death, seeking the perfection of charity in the service of God and my sisters." For those who knew her story, those words were not a mere ritual formula, but the culmination of an extraordinary spiritual journey, a path where Rita had heroically practiced these virtues long before officially consecrating them with religious vows. The first years of Rita's life at the monastery passed in apparent anonymity, devoted to the most humble tasks of the community. However, the other nuns soon noticed that there was something exceptional in the way Rita performed even the most mundane tasks. Whether sweeping the cloisters, caring for sick nuns, or working in the convent's garden, Rita transformed every action into a silent liturgy, elevating the ordinary to the sacred through a mental and spiritual presence entirely focused on the present moment. It is as if, for her, there is no distinction between the chapel and the kitchen, between worship and manual labor, remarked Sister Guardian, charged with ensuring adherence to the rule. This gift of sanctifying the everyday attracted many young nuns seeking spiritual guidance, finding in her simple yet profound words an echo of the evangelical wisdom distilled from a life faithful in the face of trials. Rita's prayer life reached mystical dimensions that soon became evident to the community, despite the saint's efforts to conceal the spiritual favors she received. Several nuns testified that they had seen Rita physically levitate from the ground during her long meditations on the Passion of Christ, her face transfigured by an inner light that seemed to reveal the divine presence. On other occasions, during the communal recitation of the divine office, Rita would lapse into such deep ecstasy that she remained motionless for hours, utterly oblivious to the outside world, wearing an expression of supernatural joy that moved even the most skeptical of her sisters. The abbess, concerned about the effect these mystical phenomena might have on community life, discreetly consulted Augustinian theologians who, after rigorous examinations, confirmed the authenticity of Rita's spiritual experiences, warning that when God chooses a soul to manifest his love in extraordinary ways, the community must facilitate that path, recognizing it as a gift for the entire church. One of the most notable aspects of Rita's spirituality was her profound devotion to the mystery of the cross. While for many Christians of her time, the Passion of Christ was merely an object of meditation during Lent, For Rita, it constituted the permanent core of her inner life, the prism through which she interpreted her entire past and present existence. She had set up in her cell a small oratory dominated by a roughly carved wooden crucifix, a gift from her father, before which she spent long hours contemplating the Saviour's sufferings. "In the cross is all my love, my hope, and my comfort," she wrote in one of the few surviving autograph notes. This identification with the crucified Christ was not merely emotional or sentimental, but profoundly theological, rooted in the Augustinian conviction that redemptive love is supremely manifested in voluntary sacrifice. For Rita, her own sufferings as a wife, mother, and now a nun only made sense when she saw them as participation in the Paschal mystery, as small crosses joined to the great saving cross. Rita's reputation for sanctity, although she tried to hide it with genuine gestures of humility, began to spread beyond the monastery walls. People from all walks of life flocked to the convent's gate seeking counsel, prayer, or simply the presence of the nun who was said to possess the gift of reading hearts and performing miracles for desperate causes. Rita received everyone with equal charity, paying special attention to women trapped in violent marriages, a situation she knew all too well from her own experience. The abbess, recognizing Rita's special gift for spiritual direction, partially relieved her of certain communal obligations, so that she could exercise this ministry of comfort without diminishing her life of prayer and contemplation. Thus, in the maturity of her religious life, Rita found the perfect balance between the contemplative and active dimensions of her vocation, embodying the Augustinian ideal of a charity that springs from contemplation and, after serving others, always returns to its divine source. Chapter 7. The Thorn of Christ. It was the year 1441, and Rita, already in her 60s, was preparing to observe Holy Week with the fervor that had always characterized her spirituality, centered on the Passion of Christ. During that Lent, her meditations on the Saviour's sufferings reached an extraordinary intensity, plunging her into such deep contemplative states that the nuns often had to call her back to her daily activities. One Friday during Lent, while listening to a sermon by the Augustinian friar Giacomo de Bevagna on the crown of thorns, Rita experienced what she would later describe as a wound of love so intense that it seemed my heart was being torn apart. On her knees before the crucifix in her cell, Rita implored with tears, "Lord, let me experience at least a small part of the pain you felt during your passion, so that I may never forget the price of my redemption." That very night, as Rita was deep in prayer, a supernatural light illuminated her austere cell. From the rays emanating from the figure of the crucified Christ, a thorn detached from the crown that encircled the Saviour's brow, and in an instant that seemed to suspend time, projected itself toward Rita, striking her directly on the forehead between her eyebrows. The pain was instantaneous and indescribable, drawing forth from her lips a cry that awakened the nuns in the adjacent cells. When they rushed in, alarmed, they found Rita unconscious, with a wound on her forehead that bore no resemblance to any natural injury, deep, throbbing, and unmistakably in the shape of a puncture made by a sharp object. Even more surprising was the expression on her face, which, despite the evident suffering, reflected a supernatural peace and joy. The stigma received by Rita, a physical participation in the Passion of Christ, experienced by only a few saints throughout history, proved extraordinary not only because of its supernatural origin, but also due to its characteristics. Unlike other stigmatized individuals who received the 5 wounds corresponding to Christ's injuries on his hands, feet, and side, Rita received only the mark of the thorn on her forehead, perhaps symbolizing her particular association with the Christ crowned with thorns, the mocked and despised king. The wound, far from healing over time, remained open for the remaining 15 years of her life, oozing a fluid that emitted an inexplicably pleasant fragrance, described by witnesses as an aroma of roses and oriental spices. More astonishing still was the fact that the wound, though constantly open, never became infected despite the limited hygienic conditions of the time, and according to some accounts, even emitted a visible glow in the darkness, especially during moments of intense prayer. The monastic community's reaction to Rita's stigma was initially one of bewilderment and, in some cases, rejection. Several nuns, fearing it might be some contagious disease, avoided her company, while others, more skeptical, suggested that it might be self-inflicted in a bid for notoriety. The abbess, prudent and balanced, consulted with physicians and theologians who, after carefully examining the case, concluded that the wound could not be explained naturally. The pleasant odor emanating from it, known in hagiographic tradition as the odor of sanctity, was particularly convincing to the examiners, as it contradicted all natural laws related to open, oozing wounds. Finally, the authenticity of the stigma was officially recognized, and Rita was permitted to continue participating in community life, with the sole restriction of wearing a special veil that partially covered her forehead, not to hide the wound, but to prevent her presence from distracting the community during liturgical services. For Rita, the thorn stigma was not primarily a sign of distinction or spiritual privilege, but a sacred responsibility and a continuous source of physical and moral suffering. Physically, because the pain was constant and often unbearable, especially during Holy Week when the wound seemed to deepen and bleed more intensely. Morally, because Rita understood that this visible sign made her a living sermon on the Passion of Christ, a responsibility that demanded absolute consistency between her outer and inner life. Often, she was heard praying in the silence of the night, "Lord, may this outward thorn be the sign of an ever more perfect inner transformation with your redemptive passion." The sufferings associated with the stigma were so intense that on several occasions, Rita pleaded with Christ to remove the visible mark, not to free herself from the pain, which she accepted as a grace, but so that she might live her self-offering in the anonymity she had always preferred. The divine response, as she later related to her confessor, was always the same. "My daughter, you have chosen to partake in my sufferings. Now you must bear this sign as a visible testimony of an invisible love, so that many hearts may turn to the truth." Chapter 8. The Rose in Winter. The harshness of the Italian winter was felt with special severity in that January of 1456. The mountains of Umbria, covered with snow, framed the monastery of Cascia, where Rita, now 75 years old, lay confined to her bed by an illness that was slowly consuming her remaining physical strength. Her cell, austere as it had always been, had now become a place of pilgrimage for the nuns of the community, who took turns caring for the elderly sister whose life of sanctity had been a light and example for more than 3 decades. The stigma of the thorn on her forehead, far from disappearing with her illness, now appeared more vivid than ever, emitting that supernatural fragrance many already associated with the presence of the saint. Despite the evident deterioration of her body, Rita's mental and spiritual lucidity remained intact, manifesting in words of wisdom and consolation that she offered to her visitors. On the cold January morning, Rita received a visit from a distant cousin who had traveled from Roccaporina upon hearing of her grave condition. After a brief exchange of news about the native village Rita had not seen since entering the monastery, the visitor asked simply, "My cousin, is there anything from your home that I can bring you? Something you wish for before you go to the house of the Father?" Rita, whose lips had barely curved into a smile during the last weeks of intense suffering, replied with an unexpected liveliness, "Yes, dear cousin. I would like you, when you return to Roccaporina, to stop by the little garden of my old house. There, near the well, you will find the rose bush I planted on my wedding day. Bring me a rose from that rose bush." The cousin and the nurse sister caring for Rita exchanged looks of concern, interpreting this request as a sign that the fever was beginning to affect her mind. Arose in the middle of January, when the fields were covered in snow and the rose bushes were completely dormant under the winter cold. Out of respect for the ailing woman, the cousin promised to fulfill the request, even though she considered it impossible. Returning to Roccaperena, more out of faithfulness to her promise than the hope of finding anything, she went to the plot where Rita's house once stood. The place, abandoned for decades, was barely recognizable, overrun with wild vegetation and, at that time of year, covered by a blanket of snow. However, near the ruins of the old well, a solitary rosebush stood defiant against all laws of nature. Amid the wintry landscape, a single rose of extraordinary beauty and perfection bloomed as if it were midsummer. Trembling not so much from the cold as from emotion, the cousin plucked that supernatural rose and without delay set off on the return journey to Cascia to deliver it to Rita. The news of the miracle of the rose quickly spread throughout the monastery and soon all across the town of Cascia. When the cousin arrived with the impossible flower, a crowd had already gathered at the convent's door, eager to witness this new sign of divine favor upon Rita. The abbess, exceptionally breaking the strict enclosure due to the extraordinary circumstances, allowed a few selected persons to enter as far as the infirmary to witness the presentation of the rose. Rita, sitting up slightly in her bed with the help of two sisters, received the flower with tears of gratitude. "This rose," she explained in a weak but clear voice to those present, "is a sign of God's faithfulness, who never abandons those who trust in him. Just as he has made this rose bloom in the midst of winter, so he can bring hope to the most desperate situations, reconciliation to the deepest hatreds, and sanctity to the souls most wounded by sin." A few days later, the miracle of the rose was complemented by a similar prodigy when the same cousin, moved by her previous experience, decided to visit also the house of Rita's parents in Roccaperena. There, in the family garden where little Rita had spent hours in prayer during her childhood, she found a fig tree laden with ripe fruits, a phenomenon equally impossible in the middle of winter. Brought to the monastery, these out-of-season figs were distributed by Rita among the sick of Cascia, producing, according to contemporary accounts, inexplicable healings. These two miracles, the rose and the figs in winter, quickly became the most recognizable symbols in the iconography of St. Rita, representing two fundamental aspects of her spirituality: the ability to find beauty and meaning amid suffering, the rose among thorns, and the supernatural fruitfulness of a life completely dedicated to God, fruits out of season. More importantly, these extraordinary signs confirmed what many already suspected, that Rita's final days on earth would be as powerful a testimony of sanctity as her entire previous life. For Rita, however, the rose held an even more personal and profound significance. In the days following the miracle, while the flower inexplicably remained fresh beside her bed without losing a single petal despite the passage of time, Rita gazed at it for hours, immersed in meditations that she would share in fragments with her confessor. "This rose," she confided in one such moment, "reminds me of the complete cycle of my life. In my childhood, I was like a bud protected by my parents' love. In my marriage, I experienced the thorns of suffering, learning that there is no rose without them. As a mother, I briefly bloomed only to see the wind of death tear away my dearest petals. And now, in the winter of my life, when everything seems to be coming to an end, God shows me that true blossoming is only beginning, and that it will be eternal in his celestial garden." These words, recorded by Rita's confessor and passed on to posterity, reveal the deep spiritual wisdom the saint had acquired through a life marked by extraordinary trials, yet also by an unwavering fidelity to the God who, like a rose in winter, can make the impossible bloom. Chapter 9. Miracles in life. Rita manifested thaumaturgic powers long before the appearance of the stigma or the winter rose. Her first documented miracle occurred when she saved a dying child during a diphtheria epidemic by handing the desperate mother her crucifix so that it could be placed on the child while they prayed together. That very night, the child recovered completely. Rita possessed a special gift for penetrating into the depths of the human soul. She achieved the conversion of Lorenzo Cecconi, a cruel landowner, by speaking to him about an unrevealed childhood trauma. This encounter transformed Lorenzo, who changed his behavior and donated much of his property to charitable works. As a peacemaker, Rita resolved family conflicts with moral authority. She reconciled the Tolomei and Buonconti families, whose enmity had claimed 30 lives over 4 generations, achieving peace by arranging a marriage between their heirs. In times of extreme scarcity, after a night of prayer, the convent's pantry miraculously appeared fully stocked. During a drought, Rita caused a spring to burst forth by plunging her crucifix into a dry well. In her later years, she was seen simultaneously in the choir and in her cell, manifesting the gift of bilocation while subsisting solely on the Eucharist. Chapter 10. The Holy Death. In May 1457, Rita faced her final days with serenity at the age of 76. The stigma on her forehead shone brightly, emitting the supernatural fragrance associated with her sanctity. Her cell was illuminated by inexplicable glows, and her face radiated a youthful beauty. On the eve of her death, Rita stretched out her arms while calling the names of her departed parents, husband, and children, engaging in conversation with them, visible to none but real to her. In conclusion, she declared, "Now I understand that nothing is lost in God. Everything that seems broken on earth is restored in heaven." On May 22nd, the monastery bells rang spontaneously. Surrounded by the community, Rita beheld her crucifix one last time and pronounced, "Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit, along with all those you have entrusted to me." As she exhaled her final breath, her cell filled with an intense scent of roses. Her body remained supple and warm, exuding a fragrance that attracted multitudes. During its public viewing, numerous miraculous healings were documented. Rita was buried in the monastery, initiating a popular devotion that continues to this day. Chapter 11. The Advocate for the Impossible. Although Rita's formal canonization would occur centuries later, her cult quickly spread. Her incorruptible body, preserved in Cascia, attracted pilgrims from all over Europe. The miracles attributed to her intercession multiplied, especially in cases that medicine or human justice deemed impossible. In 1626, a Neapolitan lawyer, after praying before her relics, won a legally impossible case. He declared, "Saint Rita has done the impossible," a phrase that spread rapidly, earning her the title Advocate for Impossible Causes. The process of canonization began in 1626 and culminated on May 24, 1900, when Pope Leo III proclaimed her a saint. Her feast day was fixed on May 22nd, the day of her death, and her popularity grew worldwide, particularly in Italy, Spain, and Latin America. Today, millions of devotees annually visit her sanctuary in Cascia. She is especially invoked in difficult marital situations, family reconciliations, and desperate medical cases, perpetuating her legacy as the intercessor for the impossible. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Rita of Cascia. O powerful Saint Rita of Cascia, advocate of impossible causes and refuge in despair, you who have known pain in all its forms and have blossomed like a rose among thorns, hear my fervent supplication. You who were the obedient daughter, mistreated wife, suffering mother, forgiving widow, and contemplative nun, understand the complexities of my heart and the labyrinths of my life where I have lost my way. May your sacred thorn illuminate my darkness, by the rose that bloomed in winter and the forgiveness you offered to your enemies, grant me the grace I so desperately need, that which seems impossible in human eyes, yet I entrust to your powerful intercession. Teach me to transform suffering into love, wounds into gateways of light, and resentment into liberating forgiveness, just as you did at every stage of your life. May your example be the beacon on my path. Amen.